What happened next has been told so many different ways by Humes under oath that the truth may be lost forever. By Humes' own account, he walked to his fireplace and burned certain autopsy evidence. Exactly what he destroyed is not known, for Humes has vacillated each time he has described the incident. He has alternately claimed he burned the original autopsy notes, or an early draft, or various notes not specifically described. He has noted that he did not want the pieces of paper splotched with the blood of the president to get into the hands of the public. Whatever he burned, such an outrageous act shows irrefutably that Commander Humes possessed little knowledge of the basic standards for conducting a forensic autopsy. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Connell, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, I feel like we haven't done this in a billion years. I think it's actually been 2 weeks. Last week was my birthday, and I released other videos that I hope you enjoyed. I released 4 videos that are little shorts that just look each at one particular aspect of Dealey Plaza. I hope to do this in the coming months, just on a random day when I have time to go down to Dealey Plaza and film for you various elements that you may be interested in if you don't live close by. So you may remember a month or two ago, the Grodins and I did a Dealey Plaza tour, and then a few weeks ago, I released a look at the south knoll of Dealey Plaza. And then these little shorts can help answer miniature questions about Dealey Plaza. So for those of you who live far away, I hope that those serve you, that you can start to get a better picture of how close everything is together and what various elements look like there in Dealey Plaza. The other thing I wanted to say is that for my birthday, the Grodins actually gave me this book that day in Dallas, and it's a signed copy by their friend, Robert Tannenbaum, as well as by Robert Grodin, who wrote the foreword. So this is a book we may look at some point in the future, but I was just really grateful to receive it. It's a new book, so if you're interested in getting that, I will try to link it in the comments. But yeah, that day in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill JFK by Robert Tannenbaum. Robert Tannenbaum, like Robert Grodin, worked on the HSCA investigation and was a witness to some of the contamination of the investigation at that time. He was a staffer, not, of course, a congressman, but an observer to many, many things that happened on that committee. So if that book's of interest to you, that's a little bit about it. The other thing that happened this last week is that I released the video interview with Vince Palomera. Now, I'll tell you, the video quality is not what I would hope for. We actually ended up having to change software right at the time of the interview, so none of that was pre-planned, and it is what it is. But if you have recommendations for reliable software that doesn't cost too much money for video interviews, then I would love to know about that, because that's an element of my channel that I would love to increase. I really enjoy having conversations with researchers, but I'm not at all resourced at this point to know software and that kind of thing that would be good for that. So if you have some sort of intel on that, I would appreciate that. And then just a look at what's coming up. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be releasing my interview with Marianne Moorman. She was, of course, one of those closest witnesses to the assassination. She took the famous photo. I have been sitting on that interview just because those take a little bit longer, sometimes the in-person ones, to edit and make sure that I do a faithful job to the opportunity it was to speak to her. So that will be coming up sometime in the next couple of weeks. And then also this last week, I got to go with Matt Douthit on what he calls his Tippit tour. And so looking deeply at the JD Tippit murder scene, witnesses, we timed it all out. It was so fun. And we even ended up at the Texas Theater. So I'm so excited to share those videos with you guys. And those will be coming in between these JFK Circling the Truth episodes that we are working through. So the final thing I need to tell you about is conferences that are coming up in a month. we have the JFK Historical Conference, and they actually put together a one-day ticket. So if you're interested in just attending the conference for one day, they said that that is $40 for my listeners. And then if you just desire to have a single speaker ticket, I'll be speaking on Thursday, so I would love to see you if that's what you would like to do. They sell those for $20. So if you're interested in being a part of that at all, those are the sort of special deals that they put together for my listeners. And then there is a link in the show notes for how you can get the entire JFK Historical Group Conference as well. And then also, I will not be speaking at, but I will be attending portions of JFK Lancer, which is the other conference happening in Dallas roughly at the same time, both of them around the time of the assassination day, of course, on November 22nd. So they start a few days before or go a day or two after. But if you are going to attend Lancer and you'd like to get a ticket and you haven't yet done so, my discount code for that conference is JFK10. It will get you 10% off of whichever tickets or package you purchase. Well, today we are getting into a book that I didn't own when we started this series. In fact, there was a piece of evidence that was cited from this book. And so people sent me photos of that particular page. Well, recently I found it for a very good deal at Half Price Books. And so I went ahead and grabbed it and have that now. And we are going to actually look at it. One of the things that's really neat about this book actually is when I went to the table of contents, it not only has what we're going to talk about today, which is Autopsy of the Century, but then the titles of some of these chapters are just super fun. So one is like Tippit's Murder, Rosetta Stone or Red Herring, Jack Ruby, Pimp for All Seasons, Fingerprints of Intelligence, and more. So it's a very compelling table of contents, I will say, and it made me want to at least peek through and find a few other chapters for reading. But today we're going to be getting into the autopsy. And I do want you to know, I've actually had some people email me about, Jess, you need to deal with David Lifton's theory and you need to deal with Doug Horne's ideas. And the truth is that I have not looked at those in depth to the degree that I would wish to before I speak publicly about them. And I do want to handle things faithfully. But the other thing is that those pieces of evidence and those theories came about long after the case. And what we are doing right now with JFK Circling the Truth is just looking at the evidence that showed itself at the time and the things that we can for sure grab hold of and make sense of from that evidence. And so there probably will be a future point at which I will look at the David Lifton alteration of the body theory and the Doug Horne alteration of the Zapruder film theory. But those are things that I'm not going to speak about in this particular circling. What we're trying to do is just look at the known facts of the time and the known investigation. That's the part that we're in now, is the investigation. So we are starting out with the autopsy. Henry Hurt begins his chapter with this quote: "The tragic thing is that a relatively simple case was horribly botched from the very beginning. And then the errors were compounded at almost every other step along the way. Here is a historic event that will be discussed and written about for the next century." He was right about that. "And gnawing doubts will remain in many minds, no matter what is done or said to dispel them." That was from Dr. Milton Halpern, the medical examiner for New York City. So one of the things that we want to look at throughout this chapter is, what do people, because I doubt you are a forensic pathologist. I'm certainly not. I doubt you're a medical examiner who does hundreds or thousands of bodily examinations of deceased persons throughout your year or throughout your lifetime. Most of us have had very few encounters, if any, with a dead body. In our modern society, we don't think or have familiarity with the dead the way we would have even if we lived 100 or 200 years ago. And so you and I are reliant on the opinions, insights, and observations that were written down by experts. let's look at the quality of those persons and their resumes who were entrusted with this important task, and then the professional opinions that come, like this medical examiner who says this was done in a horribly botched way from the very beginning, so that no matter what you think happened, you cannot rely on the medical evidence that was taken down. U.S. Senator Arlen Specter, who was the assistant counsel to the Warren Commission, said, "There is every reason to believe that we did get a comprehensive, thorough, professional autopsy report from trained, skilled experts." That's his assessment of the autopsy. Now let's read about it. In the bleak, waning hours of the day of President Kennedy's death, a team of military doctors at Bethesda Naval Hospital outside of Washington, D.C. rushed to complete the physical work of the autopsy. Their duty was mightily complicated by the presence of many luminaries crowded into the autopsy room. Among them, the personal physician to President Kennedy, the Surgeon General of the Navy, and the commanding officer of the Naval Medical Center, along with agents from the Secret Service and the FBI. In all, there were more than 24 people in the autopsy room. So don't picture a quiet, dark room, carefully lit with, I would say if it's a president that we are talking about, you should probably have a team of 4 to 10 skilled forensic autopsists who are all combing over the body and making sure nothing is missed, because this is your one chance to get it right. But what we have are dozens of people, none of whom are qualified forensic pathologists who deal with bullet wounds and all of that on a regular basis. Unfortunately, for the sake of history, there was not a single practicing forensic pathologist present. No one with any special expertise in examining bullet wounds. Adding to the pressure on the 3 clinical pathologists conducting the autopsy was the fact that the president's widow and his brother Robert, Attorney General of the United States, remained in the building. Okay, we need to understand the differences between a forensic pathologist and a clinical pathologist. A clinical pathologist is the person who might receive lab specimens and bodily fluids and look at the X-ray and MRIs of a living patient to understand if there is cancer present, leukemia, some particular diagnosis that's being evaluated. That's what a clinical pathologist is. They look at the pathology of a disease in a living patient. That is who was present. A forensic pathologist looks at a deceased patient, particularly in the case of sudden death, drownings, gunshots, unexpected deaths, and traces the likely path of how that person came to be deceased through the evidence of the body. So these are 2 completely different kinds of experts. This is the kind that was present at our president's autopsy, the kind that normally sits in a lab, not sits in a morgue or a room with a dead patient examining the body. So 2 very different kinds of pathologists. The ones who were here had not practiced forensic pathology. They were clinical pathologists. Not only that, but we are told that the president's brother and widow were still in the building. They had arrived there after Mrs. Kennedy selected that hospital for the site of the autopsy. A Kennedy aide relentlessly pressured the doctors to complete their work, since the Kennedy family would not leave the hospital until the autopsy was completed and the body prepared to be taken to lie in state at the White House. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, had signed an authorization for a complete autopsy, even though there had been initial resistance to this by the family. Under these circumstances, the confidence shown by the military pathologists seemed tentative at best. Later, they would claim to have felt hindered during their pursuit of a full examination. This autopsy team had abilities as hospital technicians and administrators, but had virtually no experience in day-to-day forensic pathology. In charge of the autopsy for the most important gunshot murder of the century was Commander James Humes, the director of laboratories at the Naval Medical School. By his own account, his experience in such matters was limited to, quote, several occasions where I have had to deal with violent death, accidents, suicides, and so forth. There is no evidence that Commander Humes had ever before performed even one autopsy on a gunshot victim. Assisting Commander Humes was Boswell, Commander J. Thornton Boswell. He was the chief of pathology at the Naval Medical School, and Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink, chief of the Wounds Ballistic section of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. We are told parenthetically, Colonel Fink was more experienced than his two colleagues, but he was called in by Commander Humes only after the autopsy was begun. Of the three doctors, only Dr. Fink was a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Among the drawbacks faced by these doctors was that of trying to perform in a hospital facility that did not, as a primary routine, conduct postmortems into gunshot deaths. Ironically, the staff at Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy was pronounced dead, was well accustomed to conducting autopsies on gunshot victims. Indeed, had Texas law been observed and the autopsy conducted in Dallas, the country might have been spared the enduring confusion spawned by these events at Bethesda. The trouble at the Naval Hospital did not begin immediately. Preparations were in place and preliminary x-rays and photographs were made of the president's body as soon as it was received at 7:35 p.m. X-ray pictures were taken of the front, back, and side of the head and also of the torso. Photographs were made showing the full face of the president as well as the massive head wound. This was all standard procedure to create a complete photographic record of the wounds. Once the actual dissection and examinations were underway around 8:15 p.m., additional x-rays and photographs were made as the work progressed. The hospital developed the x-rays that night, but the photographic film was immediately turned over to the Secret Service. According to FBI documents that logged the transfer that night to the Secret Service, there were a total of 45 exposures, along with 11 x-rays. It is impossible to assess the accuracy of these figures except to note that they were the first ones recorded. Virtually every time that the photographic material has been transferred and logged over the years, there appears to be a different count. The existence of such an impressive photographic record of the president's wounds and autopsy should have provided a historical assurance that any confusion over details of the wounds might quickly be settled. There has been confusion, to be sure, but the actual photographs have not helped. Those photographs that have not vanished remain under seal at the National Archives. From the start, for a combination of reasons, it was clear that this would be no ordinary autopsy proceeding. When Colonel Fink, who was more experienced than the others in forensic pathology, requested the clothing for examination, the request was refused. We actually discussed this with Vince Palomera. My understanding is that one of the Secret Service agents was in possession of the clothing and had brought it to his locker, his Secret Service locker, and that when it was requested, it was refused. So I'm assuming that is the person that's being discussed here, but how odd, isn't it, that evidence was being turned over to the Secret Service, but when a pathologist is requesting information so that he can make an accurate autopsy diagnosis, it's not provided. Experts in forensic pathology insist that clothing examination, the testing for bullet traces, the examination of bullet holes, is essential to the performance of a proper autopsy. In this case, the FBI was handling the examination of the clothing, not the autopsy doctors. There were 4 wounds in the president's body that were readily obvious. Each of these, in its own fashion, has stirred tremendous controversy in the ensuing 2 decades. The only agreement was that the massive hole in President Kennedy's head was the cause of death. So that's the one thing they can all agree on. But apart from that, what you get is discrepancies between Parkland and Bethesda. You get discrepancies between the initial photos and what the Parkland doctors said that they observed. You get disappearance of x-rays and photographs. There is so much that we're going to keep getting into that points at this autopsy as being problematic. But the one thing they can all agree on is the large wound in the president's head was the reason for death. Yeah. It was a horrible wound that left part of the president's brain protruding and chunks of his skull in the limousine and on the street in Dallas. Pieces of the skull were brought in while the autopsy was in progress. The debate over the president's wounds continues in some quarters to this day, and I'll remind you that this book was published in 1985. So, yeah, 40 years later, it's still in discussion. The first official description of these wounds was made by the Warren Commission, even though among the members and staff, only Earl Warren so much as glimpsed the autopsy photographs. Imagine that. You are one of 7 illustrious men who have been tasked with the important obligation to secure for your nation a confident awareness of what happened with our president's death. You're one of only 7. And only one of you can even see the photographs of that man's autopsy. How good can an investigation be into a man's death if you can't even verify with your own eyes what the state of the body, the head, the wounds, the nature of what happened with the actual physical form of that person? While the Warren Commission could have reviewed the pictures, it decided to rely on schematic drawings. Incredibly, these drawings were not based on the photographs themselves, but on the autopsy doctor's oral recollections of the wound. So what the committee was given access to was not the photos and not even drawings that were done based on the photos. Like, we're gonna protect the integrity of the president. We're going to honor him by not letting everybody in the world see his naked form on a metal table. Instead, we're going to give accurate drawings that were done from those original photos. No, not that. What was done was the autopsists actually had one whole set that we're going to read about that was done away with, but then later they wrote down their recollections of what they observed. And then orally, they told that to the person who did the drawings. And those are the drawings that the committee relied on. Not photographs, not drawings from photographs, not drawings from the original notes of the autopsists, but drawings that were done from the verbal transmission of information based on the second recollected notes of the autopsist of what had been done. And I'll remind you that autopsist wasn't even a forensic autopsist. In its report, the commission located the president's wounds, in addition to the massive head wound, as follows. A wound about an inch to the right and slightly above the large bony protrusion at the base of the skull. A wound near the base of the back of the president's neck, slightly to the right of his spine. A wound in the front portion of the president's neck. There was nothing simple about how the Warren Commission arrived at these seemingly clear-cut findings, but the commission's performance was strictly humdrum compared to the imaginative machinations of the military men who persisted in revising the autopsy report until it fit the clearly preconceived version of events created by the FBI and promulgated by the commission. Few would dispute that such manipulation lies at the root of the most public doubt that persists today. what's interesting is he talks about the widespread public doubt that existed in 1985. This is 22 years after, based on medical evidence. And just to put to silence those who would come and say, well, you haven't even looked at Gerald Posner. You don't even know. You're just a kook. The doubts have only grown stronger. We did our review of the documentary, What the Doctors Saw. In 1985, none of the following had happened. In the 90s, the photos from these autopsies were shown to Parkland doctors who all said, that wasn't what we saw at all. And then now we have the documentary, What the Doctors Saw, where they sat around and talked about what they observed. And it's not what the autopsy claims. But even before any of that was known, the medical evidence stands as one of those things that just, people can't square it. They say, obviously, there's an entry wound, there's a large exit wound. So something was coming at our president from the front. It could not have only been a lone gunman from behind. Those certainties have only grown stronger in the 4 decades since this book was written. Some of the greatest controversy over these wounds swirls about the wound described by the commission as being near the base of the back of the president's neck. So that would be here, a place you can reach, just right there. Since the Warren Commission believed the assassin was shooting downward from a 6th floor window, and since one bullet had to enter the rear of Kennedy's body and exit the front, it was essential that the rear entry wound be high enough on the president's back to accommodate the bullet exiting from the lower neck in the front. Remember, Dr. McClelland and others described this clearly as an entry wound. The person who did the tracheostomy said it was an entry wound, a small entry wound that he had to enlarge in order to make the tracheostomy tube fit inside. But the commission needs this to be an exit wound. Otherwise, it's a conspiracy. If there's any entry wounds on the front of the president's body, it's a conspiracy. So they have to have this entry wound become an exit wound. Well, you can only have that if the entry wound you're alleging is high enough up that the trajectory could make sense to people, because the shooter is up there, you're saying. So you need, if this is an exit wound, you need the entry wound to be fairly high. The actual wounds don't comply, but they don't worry about that. We're going to find out how they altered this. If the rear entry wound was at the same level or lower than the frontal exit wound, the fundamental commission thesis was knocked asunder. All of this was further complicated by the fact that the autopsy pathologists did not track a bullet path from the back to the front, a situation that could mightily disrupt the theory that the bullet passed through Kennedy. Thus, it was vital to establish the rear entry wound in the back as high as possible, and to come up with a way to state with certainty that there was a bullet path through Kennedy's body. The only known contemporaneous account of what happened during the autopsy procedure is a report made by the 2 FBI agents who observed the activities of the doctors and recorded what they saw. That report, so this is an FBI report, picture it. There's these non-forensic pathologists doing the actual autopsy. There's 2 FBI men who are chronicling what's happening in the autopsy. That report, which was not released with the Warren report, has since been disclosed. The account takes note of the discovery of the wound in the back, which the Warren Commission said was at the base of the neck, and describes what happens next. This opening was probed by Dr. Humes with the finger, at which time it was determined that the trajectory of the missile entering at this point had entered at a downward position of 45 to 60 degrees. Further probing determined that the distance traveled by this missile was a short distance, inasmuch as the end of the opening could be felt with the finger. 3 years later, a researcher for life named Josiah Thompson sought out Commander Hume's assistant, Dr. Boswell, and asked about this probing. Thompson reported Boswell told me that this was correct, and that in fact all 3 doctors had probed this wound with their fingers up to the first or second knuckle, a penetration of 1 or 2 inches. Hold up your own finger and see. That's how far the bullet had gone in, and it had gone in at an angle, at a downward angle. Boswell also indicated that the back wound had been examined with a metal probe, a thin piece of stiff wire some 8 inches long with a knob on the end. Another eyewitness to the probing was Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman, who had been riding in the presidential limousine at the time of the attack. Kellerman testified to the Warren Commission that there was consternation over the absence of a shell that might have been responsible for the, quote, hole in the president's shoulder. Note that he does not say in the base of the neck. He says the shoulder, and that's going to give indication to where the wound actually was. Let's keep listening. He described the scene this way. There were 3 gentlemen who were performing the autopsy. A Colonel Fink, during the examination of the president, from the hole that was in his shoulder and with a probe, and we were standing right alongside of him. He is probing inside the shoulder with his instrument, and I said, "Colonel, where did it go?" He said, "There are no lanes for an outlet of this entry in this man's shoulder." Dr. Fink, of course, was the lone pathologist present with some experience in examining bullet wounds. So Fink is the only one who has examined bullet wounds before. He says there's no path by which that bullet could have gotten out. Now, if you're not familiar with this, you might think, fine, okay, there's a bullet wound that goes in and has no exit point. What you're not realizing is that according to the Warren Commission, we're limited to 3 bullets. One of them hits down by Jim Tague, so we're down to 2 bullets. We have one that clearly hits the president that they are asserting came here, came out here, went into Connolly, through Connolly's wrist, lodged in Connolly's thigh. That's 1 bullet. So we have 1 bullet that went to Tague, 1 that went through both men, and then the fatal headshot. Those are the only 3 that we can account for. So if there is a bullet path where somewhere in the shoulder to neck area, there's a bullet that went in this far and did not have a path through the body, then you have at least a 4th bullet, which means conspiracy. It means there's more than 1 shooter, because you can only have 3 coming from that window, from that gun. So there are no lanes for an outlet of this entry in this man's shoulder. There's no exit path. There's no way for this bullet that's only gone in this far to get out of his body. Commander Humes later told the Warren Commission that attempts to probe in the vicinity of this wound were unsuccessful without fear of making a false passage. So you have to be careful when you're probing a bullet wound, because you could create a second wound point because the tissue is already vulnerable. You could, if you press too hard, make a different entry path. Even many people find a problem with the finger probing because technically that could have created a different trajectory, a different mode of, potential exit, or a different path for the bullet. He said later, Dr. Humes added later, "We were unable, however, to take probes and have them satisfactorily fall through any definite path at this point." Adding to the doctor's confusion was their failure to find any bullets in the body. After all, if there was no exit wound, they reasoned, a bullet should have been found. In the search for an answer, a call was made to the FBI laboratory. Only then did the doctors learn of the discovery of an unscratched bullet slug on a hospital stretcher in the Parkland emergency area. Now, note, this is the bullet that the Warren Commission is going to say is the magic bullet that passed through both men completely without hardly losing any grains of metal, and did all the damage, supposedly, through the president's body, through Connolly's chest, fracturing a rib, fracturing a 5-inch section in his wrist, and lodging in his thigh, in which, at the time that LBJ and JFK's body were already in the air on the way back to Washington, it still is remaining, a piece of it is still remaining in Connolly's thigh. So you can't have the magic bullet be that bullet, but that's the one that the Warren Commission tells us it was. But most likely, this wound path of a 1 to 2 inch wound was likely the magic bullet. That makes the most sense because later they reach out to Parkland, and here is what is said. According to the eyewitness FBI report, Commander Humes told his colleagues that discovery of the Parkland bullet accounted for the fact that no bullet was found at Bethesda to explain this bullet wound. He explained that since external cardiac massage, so they did heart massage on the president in an attempt to get his heart beating again, since that had been done at Parkland, quote, it was entirely possible that through such movement, the bullet had worked its way back out of the point of entry and had fallen on the stretcher. This news allowed Commander Humes and his associates to march toward certain conclusions, even though they made no effort to communicate with the doctors in Dallas who had tried to save the president. Around 11 p.m., when the president's body was turned over to the morticians, this is the conclusion that the autopsy team had come to. 1, that one missile entered the rear of the skull and exited from the front of the skull. So in their estimation, that creates, so remember, we've done our bodily, manipulations to try to discern how far down would you have to be for a bullet to enter here and explode out from here. But that's what their assertion is that one missile entered the rear of the skull, exited from the front of the skull, and that one missile entered the back of the president and was apparently dislodged during cardiac massage at Parkland Hospital. So those are their 2 bullets. They do not find anything that goes through the president toward Connolly at all. On the next morning, with his autopsy report already in mind, Commander Humes made his first contact with the medical team who had cared for President Kennedy at Parkland Hospital. He talked with Dr. Malcolm Perry. Dr. Humes learned that the Parkland doctors had observed a bullet wound in the front of the president's neck just below the Adam's apple. Dr. Perry explained that he had made a lateral incision across the opening of the wound, creating the opening for the tracheostomy. Commander Humes was astonished to learn of this other bullet wound, one that the autopsy team had completely overlooked. You might remember from the autopsy photos that it looks like this gaping, bloody wound, but if you look careful, you can see the bottom circle of the entry wound still present in that wound. They failed to notice that, and they just assumed that the bloody opening was the tracheostomy alone. Humes and his associates had assumed that the tracheostomy was only that and never noticed that it had been fashioned over a bullet wound. However, in 1968, a panel convened to review the autopsy found that indeed the tracheotomy did not obscure the original wound, even to the naked eye. So you can see it. You can go look it up. I've had people complain about being immediately inundated with autopsy photos, which I understand. I know that when you're watching one of these videos, you don't want to see that. And so I'll just say, go look up President Kennedy's autopsy wounds. I will tell you, if you want to get more accurate information and you're using a search, you may want to consider using Twitter's Grok. This is a total side note, but this last week I went looking for some information. I was just trying to put together a quick set of thoughts about the railroad bridge. And I was trying to remember the exact people, how many people were there on the railroad bridge. So I did the exact same input for Google's AI and for Grok, which is the Twitter AI tool. And Google's AI told me basically, conspiracy theorists have thought that there's some people on the railroad bridge, but basically there's no known information about any quotes or specific names of people who were on the railroad bridge. That was it. They gave me no names, no quotes, no information, whereas Twitter's Grok produced a chart really fast with like 7 to 10 names of known witnesses who were railroad employees that were on the bridge. as well as the 2 policemen who were stationed on the bridge, as well as pointing me toward, you might also want to look at Lee Bowers, who was a railroad employee, and also look at Jim Tague, who was standing below the railroad bridge, as both of them are important key witnesses to the assassination. So just very fascinating for me in real time to see the difference between apparently a captured AI system by Google that controls what information we have access to versus Twitter's AI which is called Grok, Grok, that produced a very clear and insightful chart with not only the names, but then the second column was their various quotes and assertions that they had said about the assassination. So I'll just say that if you are looking for information, you might avoid Google and you might try Twitter's Grok, because I have found much more accurate, much more specific, much more willing to say non-politically correct information on Twitter's Grok tool. That's all just for free. But if you're looking at those autopsy photos, even to your naked eye, you can see that bottom circle of the original entry wound. By this time that the conversation between Humes and Perry happens, the president's body is already lying in state at the White House. There was no chance for further examination. The autopsy report would have to be written to include a gunshot wound that the official pathologists had not even examined. Imagine that. Imagine that. Just let's say that it's like Joe McClanahan down here at your local county office. He's just been shot. It's the first day. Imagine that his autopsy report, they realize, oh wait, there's this whole extra bullet wound. Guess what we do? We get Mr. McClanahan's body back and we do a full and thorough investigation so that we can know for sure, by court of law, by rule of law, by just the actual principles of justice, that we have done a faithful job to tell the truth about this man's death. That's what happens for Joe McClanahan down here at our local county situation. For the president, they're like, oh, he's already lying in state, so we are not going to be able to look at this known bullet wound. It's psychotic. It's ridiculous. More than a decade later, Dr. Humes explained to the House Select Committee the details of his conversation with the Dallas doctor who had performed the emergency tracheostomy incision over the neck wound, stating that the Dallas doctor had obscured the wound very gorgeously for us. He added that the minute Dr. Perry told him of the neck wound, lights went on, and we said, we have some place for our missile to have gone. In a dramatic contradiction of his earlier positions, Dr. Humes then, for the first time, expressed his belief that the bullet wound in the back exited through the throat wound. So the wound that he probed that had no exit point, no outlet through which the missile could have gone, well now, it went through the neck. Commander Humes left the hospital soon after learning about the neck wound. Carrying with him the blood-stained autopsy reports, he went to the quiet of his home to compose the official report. To account for this new bullet wound in the throat, Humes and his colleagues had already agreed that common sense indicated strongly that the throat wound must be the exit wound for the bullet entry in Kennedy's back. It was to be a report written largely from memory. Memory surely beclouded by the last-minute introduction of a bullet wound that wasn't even seen during the actual autopsy. But in the end, everything was made to fit. The bullet wound in the throat could be explained as an exit wound, chiefly because in Humes's eyes, it could be nothing else. This proposition also could conveniently account for the back wound, even though all 3 autopsy doctors had agreed in front of numerous witnesses that this track could be palpated no more than 2 inches into the body. The back wound that had no exit and the front wound that suddenly needed to be accounted for could be explained in a mutually useful way. One could take care of the other. Moreover, the new bullet that had turned up at Parkland could be credited with the damage. So they could say, it went through down here, it came out over there, it came out onto the stretcher. which again is not what the Warren Commission will later allege. But that's how we have to account, you and I, for that bullet being found on that stretcher. All that was needed was a logical way to discover a path through the body that might connect the two wounds. The purported entry wound was caused by a bullet fired downward into Kennedy's back from a point high above him, but it somehow was to have exited below his Adam's apple. To any layman, this would seem impossible. Downward to here, coming out up here. It appeared to be a pure case of shoehorning irreconcilable pieces of evidence into a forced pattern, and in the process bending the pieces to fit. It was deep in the night when Commander Humes concluded his draft of the autopsy report. What happened next has been told so many different ways by Humes under oath that the truth may be lost forever. By Humes' own account, he walked to his fireplace and burned certain autopsy evidence. Exactly what he destroyed is not known, for Humes has vacillated each time he has described the incident. He has alternately claimed he burned the original autopsy notes, or an early draft, or various notes not specifically described. He has noted that he did not want the pieces of paper splotched with the blood of the president to get into the hands of the public. Whatever he burned, such an outrageous act shows irrefutably that Commander Humes possessed little knowledge of the basic standards for conducting a forensic autopsy. His behavior calls into question whether such an attitude guided him in other aspects of performing the autopsy and reporting the results. On the other hand, if Humes had been ordered to burn certain documents, as some respected critics believe, this would cast him in a different light. On Sunday, Commander Humes met with the other autopsy doctors to go over his draft of the report. As they were working, word came that Oswald had been murdered in Dallas. Years later, Humes told the select committee, "We interrupted our work to try and figure out what that meant to us." How Oswald's death could conceivably have any bearing on a supposedly dispassionate autopsy report being written 1,200 miles away challenges the imagination. But one thing is clear, the autopsy doctors suddenly were relieved of the burdensome possibility that whatever they wrote in the report would be examined and challenged in court by defense lawyers for the accused assassin. It is not known whether or not news of Oswald's death was the impetus for any specific revision, but the pathologists continued writing their autopsy report, one designed to provide answers for the most troublesome points hindering an easy case for the lone assassin theory. By Sunday night, when Commander Humes officially finished the report, the conclusions were markedly different from the observations recorded earlier by the FBI in the contemporaneous report. Now there was a flat statement. One missile entered the back of the president and exited in the front of the neck. Among the factors that weigh against this conclusion is that nearly every person who saw the neck wound at Parkland Hospital thought it to be an entry wound, or described it as having the typical characteristics of an entry wound. The doctors at Bethesda, who claimed they never paid any special attention to what they assumed was a tracheostomy, concluded that the neck wound was one of exit. So the people who didn't even pay attention to the wound said, oh, it was an exit wound. But the people who saw it in real life before and also noted it as a bullet wound, unlike those at Bethesda, they said it's an entry wound. Then there's the agreement of all three autopsy doctors that they could not probe the back wound but a short distance. They even concluded at the finish of the autopsy that the missile that caused the damage must have fallen out the back. They believed there was no bullet path based on their examination of the back wound. If these matters seem puzzling 22 years later, it is interesting to consider that members of the Warren Commission initially had the same reaction. In a mid-December meeting, Commissioner John J. McCloy stated that the evidence concerning bullets is looming up as the most confusing thing that we've got. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is a very long chapter, and I'm trying to get through the highlights of it. Of all the confusion and controversy spawned by the autopsy, no aspect has caused more difficulty than the furious argument over the location of the back wound. If the Warren Commission version of Kennedy's death is to make any sense, then the bullet wound in the back had to exit from the front of Kennedy's neck. Thus, it was acutely important that the back wound be in a position high enough to allow for the physical possibility of having it exit from Kennedy's neck, taking into account that the bullet had been fired from a spot above and behind the president. If the bullet that went into Kennedy's back did not exit from his neck, then there is no ordinary way to explain the neck wound except as a wound of entry. This, of course, would mean there was a shooter in front of Kennedy as well as one behind, thus leading to the indisputable conclusion of a conspiracy. In the accounts of the witnesses to the autopsy, there is not a single instance of anyone describing the wound in back as being in Kennedy's neck. The FBI and Secret Service agents all described the wound as being either in the back or the shoulder. Now that's important. Think about the way we use words. Think about if you are trying to accurately describe something going on back here. There is a section that you would rightly say is neck. And there is a point at which you start to describe something as shoulders or back. And we all know as humans, we're not forensic pathologists, but we understand the significance. And to be clear, neither were the Secret Service agents talking about the wounds. They are not forensic pathologists, but there is clear delineation. And where would you say it is? It's right here. This is the point at which it stops being neck and it starts being back or shoulders. So even with average Joe people who are not forensic pathologists, we can recognize the difference between those two particular words. And the fact that they all use the words back or shoulder and none of them uses the word neck makes it interesting, because you have a downward trajectory hitting below here, a downward trajectory hitting below here that's coming out of the neck. One Secret Service agent even used the neck as a reference point in describing the location of the wound. Clint Hill, remember, he is the one who jumped on the back of the car. He testified that he observed the wound about 6 inches down from the neckline on the back, just to the right of the spinal column. I mean, you guys, I'm going to pull it out right here. 6 inches. 6 inches down from the neckline. 6 inches. 6 inches down is where the entry wound for that back wound would have been. You don't get there and also come out here and have it be from up there. That is an impossibility. Absolutely impossible. It was only later, in the preparation of the revised autopsy report, that the wound began to be described as higher on the body. In the final analysis, the Warren Commission placed the rear wound at the back of his neck, which allowed it to be aligned with the neck wound up in front. So the Warren Commission moves the wound by about 6 inches and says, oh, it's up here at the back of the neck, so then it can come out here. If the location of the wound had not been moved up, the basic thesis of the Warren Commission would have appeared even more ludicrous. One of the original pieces of autopsy evidence that survived Dr. Hume's fireplace was the actual body chart of the president's wounds, prepared by Commander Boswell. The diagram is compelling evidence that the back wound was precisely where the various autopsy witnesses said that it was. Commander Boswell has casually dismissed what he claims is an error on his part, explaining that the diagram was only a rough sketch. Nonetheless, the other wounds pinpointed in Commander Boswell's diagram all appear almost precisely correct. It is significant that the back wound in Commander Boswell's diagram is not really even near the neck, but clearly down the back and to the right. In the course of events, Commander Boswell's diagram became a part of the Warren Commission evidence, showing the wound well down Kennedy's back. Admiral George Berkeley, President Kennedy's personal physician, who had been present at the autopsy, had examined Dr. Boswell's diagram of the wounds and written verified and signed his name. So the president's personal physician looked at the diagram that showed the wound as being down the president's back and verified it and signed his name. It is significant that Dr. Berkeley had been with the president in Dallas, with him in the Parkland Hospital emergency room, with his body as it was flown east, and present during the autopsy. It is also significant that even though he was the only doctor present, both at Parkland and at Bethesda, his testimony was never taken by the Warren Commission, nor was it taken later by the House Select Committee. In 1982, Dr. Berkeley told the author in a telephone conversation that he believed that President Kennedy's assassination was the result of conspiracy. The footnote for that says that he had an interview with Admiral George Berkeley in 1982. So he is saying that he, Henry Hurt, the author of this book, spoke with Dr. Berkeley, and that Dr. Burke said in a telephone conversation that he believed that President Kennedy's assassination was the result of a conspiracy. This startling statement, after so long a silence, amplified an obscure exchange that Dr. Berkeley had had in an oral history interview on file at the Kennedy Library in Boston. The interviewer asks Dr. Berkeley if he agrees with the Warren report, quote, on the number of bullets that entered the body. You might remember his answer. He said, I would not care to be quoted on that. That's the president's physician, who was present in all four places, with the president in Dallas, with the president in Trauma Room 1, with the president as it was flown east, with the president during the autopsy. And he says, I would not care to be quoted on that. And to this author, he said, it was the result of a conspiracy. There is a little footnote here at the bottom that I'm going to read to you. It says, when he originally telephoned the author, Dr. Berkeley expressed his willingness to discuss various matters concerning the assassination. He asked for a letter detailing the areas the author wished to discuss. Dr. Berkeley acknowledged receipt of the letter with a letter of his own. 2 months later, the author proposed a meeting with Dr. Berkeley to discuss the points. The doctor responded with an abrupt refusal to discuss any aspect of the case. So they had a call, they had an exchange of letters. 2 months later, he's refusing to discuss anything. So we're given that little bit of information and insight of what happened after he reportedly told the author that he believed the president's death was as a result of conspiracy. Although the autopsy doctors were denied access to the president's clothing, the FBI laboratory examined it and pinpointed to the Warren Commission the exact location of the bullet holes in the back of Kennedy's jacket and shirt. In each instance, the bullet hole was between 5 and 6 inches from the top of the back of the collar and between 1 and 2 inches to the right of the midline of the clothing. This location, of course, was precisely where so many autopsy witnesses, including the president's personal physician, agreed that they were. Undaunted by this evidence from the FBI laboratory, the Warren Commission reported the findings and described the location of the holes in the clothing as being, quote, in the vicinity of his lower neck. 5 and 6 inches, you guys. We just talked through this. Okay, you don't go 5 or 6 inches down the back and have that still be called the neck. It doesn't work. The Warren Commission was fiddling with the facts, and it's deliberate. It's not accidental. In light of the preposterous handling of evidence by officials and the Commission's nearly incomprehensible interpretation of it, there is no difficulty in understanding the massive skepticism of the American public. It was this issue, more than any other, that propelled those early critics, primarily Epstein, Lane, Weisberg, and Marr, to expose the incompetence and duplicity that were integral to the most important autopsy of the century. There was never any disagreement among the doctors that the original autopsy was disastrous in the way it was performed and in many of the specific findings. While most of the doctors seemed restrained as they made criticisms, Dr. Cyril Wecht was not. As a side note, I have a few points of sadness at the time of my entry into the investigation of the JFK case. One is that I was not able to interview Ruth Paine before she passed away. She, of course, if you follow the channel, you know her story and her role in the case stands as one of the most fascinating aspects for me personally. But another great sadness that I have is that I did not get to meet Dr. Cyril Wecht. I hear nothing but enjoyable things about him, and among the lectures that you can listen to about the JFK case, his are far and away some of the most enjoyable and humorous, which is funny because he is a forensic pathologist who talks about the medical state of the body. So you wouldn't think that would be something that could be hilarious, but somehow he makes it enjoyable and funny as you listen to very terrible and tragic information from him. He had been a former president of the American Academy of Forensic Medicine, so the president of the Academy of Forensic Medicine. Dr. Wecht had been one of the earliest and most outspoken critics of the president's autopsy. His analytical articles describing his reservations appeared in medical journals for years. He described the autopsy with these words, quote, extremely superficial and sloppy, inept, incomplete, incompetent in many respects, not only on the part of the pathologist who did this horribly inadequate medical legal autopsy, but on the part of many other people. This is the kind of examination that would not be tolerated in a routine murder case by a good crew of homicide detectives in most major cities of America. Dr. Bodden himself may have pinpointed one of the most serious problems when he testified that, quote, experience of each and every panel member is that in a homicide situation, the last person to have control and tell the medical examiner how to proceed is the family. The very concept of the family having control of the body causes great concern for forensic pathologists because of its implication in other homicides where the family is not permitted to have control over what happens to the bullet that killed Uncle Louie. The DA handles that, not the family. There is an entire section here that we are not going to walk through by virtue of time, but also by virtue of the fact that we have several videos on this channel that talk about the head wounds. One of them is in this series. Another one I did in May of 2025. So you can look at the head wounds and look that up on my channel and get more information. But for the sake of time and for the sake of what my voice can stand today, we are not going to read about the head wounds, but just know that this book and this chapter does deal with discrepancies between the head wounds that were observed by Parkland doctors and nurses and eyewitnesses and the head wounds that are described by the autopsy that was entered into Warren Commission official evidence. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this chapter with the final 2 pages from it. It says, one of the most fragile underpinnings of the official version of President Kennedy's murder is the proposition that a bullet entered his back, passed through his body, exited from his lower neck, went on to pass through Governor Connell. Official medical experts largely agree that this is what happened. If it did not happen this way, it is generally agreed then there was a second assassin, and thus a conspiracy. The whole flimsy case becomes unglued. Enormous official effort has gone into trying to prove this particular point. Comedy has flashed through the outrageousness as doctors arbitrarily moved the location of the back wound several inches upward so that it could be high enough to manage a logical exit from the front of the neck. Even though the bullet, which the Warren Commission said hit no bones in Kennedy, was supposedly moving at a sharp downward angle when it entered Kennedy's back. It was a tough case to make, and few people ever believed the government's feeble account. Still, it is the official version. Government officials and their supporters have worked over the years to maintain this legend. Some apparently perjured themselves in service to the cause. Meanwhile, a lone citizen was pursuing the question from quite a different angle. Of the millions of Americans who believed the official version to be a lie. Harold Weisberg set out to prove it so. I have this book. I have several others here, as well as a photographic whitewash. So he put out 4 books with the title Whitewash, I believe. Whitewash, Whitewash 2, Whitewash 3, and Photographic Whitewash that looks at the problems of the photography in the case. Alone, he has come far closer to making his case on this point than the whole United States government has in defending its. Weisberg did not focus on the location of the back wound. He accepted that the body chart drawn and later disavowed by Commander Boswell was correct in showing the back wound to be between 5 and 6 inches below President Kennedy's collar line. The HSCA finally agreed that the wound was much lower than previously concluded by the Warren Commission. Weisberg was far more interested in the wound in the front of the neck that was supposed to be the exit for the bullet in the back. The autopsy report, which was embraced by the Warren Commission, described this wound as being in the low anterior neck. That front neck wound, of course, was largely believed to have been one of entry by those experienced observers at Parkland Hospital. That was the thrust of their initial impressions and was stated several times at a press briefing conducted at the hospital by a White House official. But the official version ruled that it was a wound of exit and suggested that the exiting bullet caused the nick on the side of the knot of the president's tie. The government version also suggested that the slits through the front of the neckband of the president's shirt were caused by an exiting bullet. The initial difficulty with the government's case was that the FBI laboratory, after spectrographic analysis, could find no metal traces on the tie or the neckband of the collar, traces that should have been there if a bullet had caused the damage. The second major problem was one that often plagued the commission: a highly credible witness who saw and said things that contradicted the larger picture. Dr. Charles Carrico, the doctor who examined Kennedy in the emergency room before his shirt and tie were removed, testified to the Warren Commission and later confirmed in an interview that the anterior neck wound was above the knot of his tie. A wound location this high in the front would render fatuous the whole teetering premise of the Warren Commission. The commission ignored Dr. Carrico's testimony on this point, even though he was the doctor in the best position to have any direct knowledge. Weisberg pressed his case in court to have the National Archives release clear photographs of the president's shirt and tie, because the pictures that had been provided by the FBI to the Warren Commission were unclear and virtually worthless. The photographs finally disclosed to Weisberg show that the suggested bullet holes in the shirt's front neckband are not bullet holes at all. They are slits made by scalpels used by nurses to cut off the president's necktie. One nurse who cut off the clothing confirmed this, adding impressive credence to Weisberg's observations. The other astonishing confirmation is that the bullet hole in the back of the shirt is precisely where the first body chart placed it. That chart had been commissioned by the commission and disavowed by the doctor who prepared it. The testimony of Dr. Carrico, combined with the revelations in the photograph, shows with absolute certainty to almost any layman that the bullet that entered Kennedy's back nearly 6 inches below his collar at a sharply downward angle could not possibly have exited from Kennedy's neck above the collar, where Dr. Carrico saw the wound. Where then did the frontal neck wound come from? That is a question never pursued by the commission. The answer is one that the government seems not to want to know. That is the end of the autopsy chapter in Reasonable Doubt by Henry Hurt. I hope you enjoyed this reading. It was definitely insightful to hear play by play the way that the autopsy came to certain conclusions, and then the president's body is gone, and then they learn, oh, there was a bullet wound here. And then they have to alter their findings in order to accommodate that. And even that, then they were still connecting that with the bullet that would have fallen out on Kennedy's stretcher, which of course, if the bullet had continued traveling through Connolly into Connolly's thigh, that same bullet could not have been the one that fell out on Kennedy's stretcher. So very fascinating. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Let me know what you liked about it. Let me know if there's more information that we need to know. You can share. Well, links are getting more difficult to share, I will say that. But you can at least share the title of the article that someone should read or the title of the video that someone should watch. You can still share that in the comments, even if links are sometimes being policed by YouTube. I am getting more reports of comments that are disappearing. One way that you guys and I have learned not to have our comments disappear is to not include links. So I will say that. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Can't wait to hear from you. And we will keep going with the investigation and move toward the Warren Commission in our upcoming episodes. Have a great day.